In the opening of this episode, Samantha discovers her brother Will is on the brink of turning into a werewolf, but Samuel and Riley prevent her from saving him. What makes Samantha believe Riley is the mastermind behind this? And how will she find a way out while being blocked by Raven? Join our pack. Subscribe to start your adventure. Chapter 40. I Can't Let You Go. I stared for a moment at the red door, half expecting Samuel to come back and take me with him. I refused to believe that he'd actually left me alone, or that he didn't so much as think twice about leaving me behind. Much to my surprise and distaste, the thought stung. It pulled at my heart in places I hadn't even realized Samuel had strings attached to. Our time together since I'd been brought back to town was decent. Samuel had been trying. He didn't seem to be keeping things from me, he was giving me my space and he wasn't pushing me. Though I refused to admit it, I was beginning to find I didn't hate the man, and I'd begun to trust him, if only slightly. While I held a deep resentment for my situation, I couldn't find it in me to blame Samuel for the things going wrong. But when the heavy door stayed closed, it felt like everything shattered. The small portion of me that was finally starting to relax took a plunge into the ocean. I stared at the door for a second more, before a frustrated scream escaped my lips. I shot my hands through my hair, pulling at it to ease the hysteria rising in my chest. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the woman named Raven flinch, but I paid her no mind. In the moment, I could do nothing but let a slew of curse words rain from my lips, each and every one of them directed at Samuel. Without thinking, I let out another mangled cry and reached for my shoes. I pulled them on in a smooth motion, ignoring the fact that I wouldn't make it 2 steps outside this apartment. I wasn't naive enough to believe Samuel left someone with me for the company. However, I was going to do everything in my power to get out of here and get to my brother. Sure enough, the minute I headed for the front door, Raven was blocking my way. She stood before me, taller and stronger but with hesitation. Her chocolate brown eyes refused to meet my own. "Move," I ground out, ignoring her anxious expression. "I'm sorry, but I can't let you go." Her voice was soft, but it held an unwavering conviction. As she spoke, she pushed her black, wavy hair behind her ears. I sighed, pinching my nose. "Look, I don't know if you understand, but my brother is going to be killed if I don't leave this apartment." Her stance faltered. The minute it did, I darted around her. She was caught off guard and I was able to grip the doorknob and pull it harshly. However, when I did, it didn't move. No matter how hard I pulled against the shining metal, the door refused to open. "What the hell?" I cried out, relentlessly tugging at the door. The next moment, Raven was in my vision and pulling me back. Her grip was surprisingly strong and it was enough to make me lose my footing, causing me to trip backward and fly through the air. Before I could hit the ground though, she caught my elbow and lifted me back up. "They locked it from the outside," she huffed, straightening the both of us. I ripped my elbow from her arm, scowling at the door. Just as I was about to try it again, Raven placed herself in between me and the wood. Her back was leaning against the door, and when I glared at her, she awkwardly tucked her arms behind her back. "I'm sorry about your brother," she rushed out. "But I can't let you leave. Both the Alpha and Beta told me to keep you here." I paused. "Both of them?" She slowly nodded, her short waves falling back on her face. "Both of them. Alpha Riley told me if I let you leave then I'd have to face him in the morning." She paused, looking directly into my eyes. "Please don't leave." Her words hit me like a freight train. "He threatened you." "I'm sorry." I paused, staring at her. I'm sure it came across as a cold and hard glare because honestly, I couldn't keep the expression off my face. I was completely torn. There was no doubt in my mind that I had to get to Will, or he would be killed. But if I left, the very same could happen to this woman. Abruptly, I let out another scream of frustration. Raven flinched back again, her already light skin paling even more. She took a hesitant step back further into the door, but I paid her no mind. Instead, I stalked towards the kitchen, pacing back and forth. I hated that I was doing it, as it reminded me too much of the same exact thing Samuel did when stressed. But I couldn't keep still. My mind was racing, my heart was pounding, and my soul was being crushed. "I'm sorry," Raven told me again from across the room. "If I could help you, I would. What do you know about humans being bit and turned?" I suddenly questioned, turning to face her. My fingers strummed against my legs. It was the only thing keeping the panic in my chest from rising. She stammered. They don't often survive the shift. I know that. What else? Raven was at a loss. There's not much more. They're bit, then they shift for the first time on the full moon. What about after? How many have survived? I'm sorry, but we haven't had a human survive the shift in a while. It's just too hard on their bodies. Normally, we don't even turn the ones we keep anymore. I leaned up against the kitchen counter, ignoring the turned-over barstool at my feet. Another scowl was etched onto my features, but this one was laced with more than anger. I was terrified. Terrified of what was happening just beyond the walls of the apartment. Will was out there and he was probably going to die. Not only that, but there was absolutely nothing I could do about it. What is the shift like? I questioned, my feet tapping incessantly in time with my fingers. I'm not sure you want to know, she trailed off. My jaw tightened and I ground out, what is the shift like? I looked up for a moment, catching Raven's expression. She looked almost as terrified as I felt. Painful mostly. I've heard it's worse for humans. If you're born a wolf, then you've already got it in your system. When a human's bit, their entire being changes. The hardest part is not letting the new body kill the old. I stilled my body, tensing even more. Every word that left this woman's mouth was another reason I needed to be there to help Will. Not only that, but this could be the only chance I had to see him alive. Now, Samuel and Riley would be the last faces he would ever see. Silence fell between us for a short minute, and the entire time Raven stood in front of the door, unmoving. I refused to look at her, but I knew she was doing nothing but studying me. The air was tense, and I knew if I opened my mouth I would be screaming. The reality of the situation was hitting me, and it was all I could do to stay calm. On the one hand, I could attempt to get around Raven. There were multiple things I could do. I was already in the kitchen, and I knew where we housed the knives. It wouldn't be easy, but I could do it. I was sure of it. And I'd get to see Will, even if it was for the last time. But, on the other hand, if I managed to escape, Raven would probably be dead in the morning. Riley didn't keep light on his threats. Every word he spoke of them was completely true. If I fought against this woman, I'd be sealing her fate. Raven let out a small and shaky breath, her timid voice cutting into my inner turmoil. Is that what's happening to your brother? Confusion swam through my mind and leaked into my scowl. Did they not tell you? She shook her head. No. But you still came here. Of course. I stared at her blankly. Why? She raised her eyebrow, eyeing me with uncertainty. When one of the leaders of the pack asks you to do something, you do it. I rolled my eyes and attempted to hold back a scoff. I wasn't too successful. She sighed. I'm sorry. This is ridiculous, I glowered, once again torn. I lifted myself up onto the counter, pushing aside a broken glass. The movement burned my side, but as usual I ignored it. Instead, I tucked my legs into my chest, holding myself together as tightly as I could manage. I was tempted to rock back and forth, but I didn't want to appear on the verge of a breakdown. Not when I had no idea who Raven was. Not when I didn't know if I was going to try and get around her. Raven watched me, her shoulders slumping. However, instead of responding, she slowly moved away from her position where she was guarding the door. When I didn't move towards it, she let out a long breath and headed to the living room. There, she began turning furniture right side up, attempting to erase the evidence of Samuel's tantrum. Her brown eyes darted to me every few seconds though, never letting me out of her sight for too long. I watched her for a few moments, calming my erratic heartbeat. I eventually ground out begrudgingly. You don't have to do that. Samuel can pick up his own mess. She shrugged. The beta has better things to do. Right, I scoffed. It wasn't easy to keep the venom out of my voice. Raven paused, turning to face me, casting her eyes to the ground. I'm sorry. If you're sorry, then you'd let me leave. You can't leave. I can't even leave. Not until one of them returns. I shook my head in disgust. Why is it that you people do everything they say? Can't you think for yourselves? She hung her head, twisting the black shirt she wore. I'm sorry. Her voice was small and practically non-existent. I watched Raven for a moment, trying desperately to hate her. She was the thing keeping me from leaving. She was the reason I wasn't with Will right now. She was a werewolf. If I could just find a way to get around her, then I'd be free. But I also knew that wasn't the entire truth. That was just what I was telling myself to justify potentially getting her killed. In reality, the only reason she was here was that a selfish and tyrannous alpha ordered her to babysit me. Not only that, but he threatened her life if she couldn't keep me here. No, I eventually sighed, burying my head in my knees. I'm sorry. This isn't your fault. Raven didn't respond, but after a moment I looked up to find her straightening the living room, once more. I watched as she tried putting furniture where it belonged, but she clearly had no idea where anything was supposed to go. Holding back a groan, I hopped off the counter and made my way over to her. She started to get between me and the door once more, but I shook my head and half-heartedly pointed to the spot where the couch belonged. She immediately understood and quickly moved the heavy piece of furniture in that direction. When I tried to help her move it, she refused. I'm sorry, but the beta told me not to let you strain yourself, she huffed, easily maneuvering the three-person couch. I don't need help anyway. We continued in silence for the next few minutes. Raven would direct the furniture where I pointed, and I would pick up the pillows and any broken objects. I was amazed at the damage Samuel had managed to do, and I was slowly realizing how truly upset he was. He ceased throwing things around when he saw me, but I knew he still wanted to. This brought my thoughts back to the hurt that flashed through his face when he told me Riley had kept Will's bite a secret. It tugged lightly at my heart, but as soon as the sympathy came, I pushed it away, reminding myself that he'd left me in the apartment while my only brother was dying. It took almost an hour to successfully clean up the trash department, and when we were done, my hand flinched to my pocket. The small phone rested there, and I wanted desperately to pull it out and see if Samuel had contacted me. The entire time I helped Raven clean, I couldn't stop thinking about what was happening beyond this apartment. I hadn't made the conscious decision to stay, and every few seconds my eyes would glance at a door or window, but I'd meet Raven's eyes each time I did, and I knew I wouldn't be able to leave. If I left, who knew what would happen to the timid woman before me? When I thought about it, I was sure that's the reason Riley and Samuel wanted her here in the first place. Samuel may have been thinking about not letting me out, but Riley had probably figured out I wouldn't risk someone's life for my own gain. That was his specialty. Are you tired? Raven eventually asked, hesitantly sitting down on the cream couch. It faced two matching armchairs with a wooden, now broken coffee table in between. I could help you to your room if you need it. The beta told me to let you sleep. I sat down heavily in the chair across from her, sinking into the cushions. The beta seems to have told you a lot of things, I grumbled, staring out the open window behind Raven. It gave me a clear view of the moon and stars, just like the window in my bedroom. Sighing, I continued. But no, I don't think I'll be sleeping tonight. She smiled sadly. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to do what he says. A thought suddenly entered my mind. Did he threaten you? Her eyes went wide. The beta. I nodded and she vehemently shook her head. Of course not. He's the only one who is kind to me. Sure, he can be firm, but he's never threatened me. I let out a long breath I didn't know I'd been holding. When I didn't respond, Raven continued on in a small voice. Can I ask you a question? I sighed. Sure. She hesitated, looking at me cautiously. Is it true he is your mate? My lips pursed. That's what he thinks. A hint of a smile tugged at Raven's lips. Can I ask you another question? You don't have to keep asking me if you can ask me questions. It's fine. Sorry, she nodded. What do you think? What do I think about what? Is he your mate? I sighed again, this time much heavier. Humans don't have mates. She nodded thoughtfully. It was the first expression I'd seen her take on, other than caution or fear. My eyebrows furrowed, but I didn't dwell for too long. My fingers still bounced in time with my legs, and I was trying desperately to keep my panic at bay. Though I wasn't actively trying to escape, my mind kept playing out the scenarios where I would. Each one would end with me finding Will dead. Raven watched me carefully. Are you all right? I shook my head, my leg bouncing beneath me. No. She sighed. I really am sorry. Stop saying that. You didn't have a choice. I hung my head. I know what it's like. Raven hesitated, watching me with sympathy. I could feel her gaze burning holes in the top of my head, but I couldn't bring myself to look up. He's not bad, you know, she started. The beta. He takes care of us. He's the only one who treats me well. I slowly lifted my head, furrowing my eyebrows. What do you mean by that? She shrugged. I'm an Omega. The pack doesn't really care for people like me. I'm the lowest of the pack compared to them. That's ridiculous, I scoffed. Why are they any better than you are? They just are. It's their blood, their position, their family. I'm not upset by it though. I'm used to it. It's nothing I can change. I shook my head in disbelief. It's not right. I didn't bring it up to get sympathy, she told me simply. I wanted to try and show you that it's not all bad. If your brother is in the hands of the beta, he's got a good chance. She smiled, tilting her head and watching me. Even if that were true, I still need to be there. Will needs me. She tilted her head the other direction, leaning further into the couch. The beta's right though. It's not safe. Her words, much like Samuel's, went in one ear and out the other. Will wouldn't hurt me. Raven opened her mouth to respond, but both of our attention was pulled away from an echo of a noise outside the open window. I whipped my gaze towards it, just in time to hear another much louder mangled scream. Though it was distant and unintelligible, I knew what it was the moment I heard it. Will's screams. I shot to my feet, my side burning with the action. Raven quickly followed suit, her gaze darting to the window. The noise sounded again, and just as I moved my feet to run to the window, Raven was there, shutting it tightly. She whirled around to face me, but the only thing I could do was stare at the glass. The noise was gone, but the damage was done. The tears that threatened me all night finally filled my eyes, betraying my emotions. Desperately, I looked at Raven, pouring every pleading word possible into my stare. She seemed lost and uncertain, but the smallest shake of her head answered my unvoiced question. I wasn't leaving. Instantly I broke down. My legs gave out and I fell to the floor in a tangled heap. Raven caught me before I could hurt myself, but I barely registered her body beside me. A scream escaped my lips and blended with my sobs. Tears relentlessly poured from my eyes and onto my clothing. I clutched my chest, barely aware that I couldn't breathe. In that moment, it was the last thing I wanted to do. Raven's hand ran up and down my back. She spoke softly in my ear, though her voice was strained and tense. I pushed her presence from my mind, as it was only another reminder of what was happening. The phantom screams from the window pierced my ears again and again, and my mind began to conjure images of Will. He was bloodied, he was broken, and then he was dead. Chapter 41. I exploited it. My senses came back slowly. First, it was the burning of my side. Then it was a soft hand running up and down my back. Lastly, it was Raven's voice, small and tense, whispering lies of encouragement. I tried to dwell on those lies. I tried to believe them, but I couldn't. No matter how desperately my heart pined for encouragement, I couldn't believe that Will would survive. When the tears fell silently, Raven pulled back to look me in the eyes. She was silent for a few long moments before she bowed her head and dropped her hand from my back. I'm so sorry, she whispered. When I didn't respond, she looked up, watching me carefully. Do you need anything? Water. Her voice was barely a whisper of the wind. It was as if even talking too loud would cause me to break once more. To her, I was nothing more than a house of cards precariously balancing on my tears. Slowly I nodded. It took her only seconds to leave me and return with a glass. I pressed it to my lips, not really feeling the cold liquid enter my system. When the water was gone, Raven took the glass and set it on the ground beside us. I could tell she wasn't comfortable with silence because after a tense, silent moment she asked, "Are you all right?" No, my voice cracked. Sorry, stupid question, she trailed off. It's going to be okay though. It's going to be okay. I didn't respond. Raven continued, filling the silence. She rambled on, and half the things she said I didn't hear. Whether the nonsensical talking was for her benefit or my own, I couldn't tell. Maybe she knew that it was better to fill the silence with useless words rather than allow memories of Will's screams. Maybe she just didn't want me to break again. Hey, she eventually paused, rubbing a hand up my back again. I know I said humans don't often survive, but he's in good hands. I can promise you that. Had it been any other situation, I would have rolled my eyes. I didn't even have to think before I croaked, Riley's not good hands. I was talking about the beta. I shook my head slowly, my voice as dead as I felt. Neither of them are good hands. Raven shifted her weight. I knew it wasn't in her nature to talk down about the leadership of her pack. It was like that for any werewolf. But I didn't care. Not that I was making her uncomfortable. Not that I was showing my hatred for her kind. None of it mattered anymore. I was going to lose everything. The thought struck me harder than a bullet piercing my skin. For the next few moments it was all I could think of. My mother was gone. Will would soon be dead. And what was I doing? What had I been doing all week? Sitting in an apartment waiting for something to happen. A new feeling rushed through me. Initially, it was shame at my cowardice and refusal to act. It wasn't that I hadn't tried to escape. The first day had consisted of nothing but me searching Samuel's apartment for any openings that weren't guarded. But after that I'd given up. When I saw that there were too many werewolves, too many odds stacked against me, I'd sat down in my bedroom and brooded, resigning myself to the fact my life was no longer my own. I accepted that my existence was only to make Samuel happy. Next I felt contempt. Contempt and anger. However, it wasn't outwardly focused anymore. This anger was directed at me. The entire week I'd been too involved in my own self-pity to even realize what was happening. I was too scared and defeated to fight as I normally would. The girl that had run, the girl that had risked everything to save her and her family's lives, was pushed behind a wall I hadn't even consciously built. And now it took the last bit of what meant something in my life to finally wake me up. Raven, I started, my voice shaking. I turned to face her as I spoke, initiating eye contact. My hands twisted forward, catching her wrist as it once again started to smooth over my back. I stopped her from further movement, and she looked at me, confused. Stop. She immediately stiffened. Her expression grew guarded and she looked at me warily. I didn't allow her expression to linger before I was speaking again. This time my voice held a small amount of strength. Do you have a family? Raven looked at me bewildered. I could tell she was trying to follow my thought process, but in that moment, even I was having a tough time keeping up with it. I was purely following the new feeling rising in my chest, pushing me forward to do what I feared most.
Risk everything.
Yes, Raven eventually whispered, uncertainty tainting her soothing tone. What would you do if they were in trouble? Again she hesitated. I'd help them. Slowly I nodded. Of course you would. They're your family. That's what I would do. She leaned away from me, her wavy hair falling on her face. It covered her features, masking the cautious expression I knew she'd adopted. My family is in trouble, I started slowly. Each syllable that left my mouth, however, added to the new feeling rising in my chest. It caused my heart to quicken, my lungs to ache. My mother is missing and could already be dead. If I don't do something, then my brother will be too. You can't leave, Raven quickly shook her head. She was pleading now. The alpha will kill me. I hesitated. There it was again, the one obstacle between me and that door. My heart tugged one way in my chest, while the other half was already sprinting out of the apartment. I can protect you. The words left my mouth before I knew what I was saying. But when they did, I didn't take them back. For once I was letting my body run on instinct. I wasn't holding back. There would be no more caution, not if I wanted to save Will. She looked at me dubiously. How can you do that? No offense, but that's one of the reasons the beta wanted me here. To protect you. Samuel is on my side. I told her with as much force as I could muster. If I tell him to protect you, he will. I didn't know if it was true. I didn't know if I'd be able to protect Raven at all. But in this moment I didn't care. For the time being, we both had one common enemy. One common threat. If I had any chances of getting this woman to listen to me, I had to use that in whatever other means I could. Unfortunately, the only resource I believably had was the mate bond with Samuel. So I exploited it. Samuel is my mate. I tried not to cringe as I said the words aloud. If keeping you safe means that much to me, he'll make sure it happens. Her breathing quickened. I don't know. The alpha, she trailed off. Raven inched further away from me. I could tell I was quickly losing her, so I did the only thing I could think of. I played further on the common ground between us, revealing the one thing I swore I would never speak of. I didn't know what was coming over me, and I knew that when I came to my senses I would probably regret every word that left my mouth, but I didn't stop. Riley's threatened me too. My voice was small, betraying the fact I was wrestling with my own emotions. However, I paused before continuing, waiting for Raven's reaction. Her body stilled again, and she ceased her inconspicuous movements. When I knew I had her attention, I sighed heavily. He's threatened me and my family. If I don't let Samuel change me, if I don't make him happy, he'll kill them. She cast her eyes to the floor. I'm sorry. Stop saying that, I snapped. My eyes darted to the window, watching the full moon for the briefest of moments. If you're really sorry, then help me. I reached my hand for hers, squeezing it tightly. Her palm was limp in mine, and I knew her resolve was failing. After a moment, I gave her a small smile. I can't do this without you. Raven took her hand from mine and rubbed it on her legs slowly. Her brow furrowed, and she refused to meet my eyes. I can't just disobey my alpha's orders. You're not disobeying him. You're following the beta's order to keep me safe. I'm leaving one way or another, and having you there would lower the risk of me getting killed. Again, I didn't know if I was telling the truth. Maybe that's why Raven so easily bought it. I don't even know how to get out of here, she half cried. You saw the door. Her hand no longer ran up her leg but rested firmly on her hip. I tried to hold back a smile, though my heart leaped at her words. It wasn't an outright agreement to my proposal, but it was close enough. We can figure it out. I rose to my feet almost too quickly. My body swayed, threatening my balance. I reached my hand out to steady myself against the chair, and Raven was at my side in an instant. I don't think you understand, she huffed as she released me. It's locked from the outside. I saw it. There's a bar across the door. It was hard to ignore that knowledge even as my hopes were rising. We were too high up to attempt an escape from the window, and there weren't any other ways to leave the apartment. When Samuel first dumped me here, I checked for air vents, attics, trapdoors, extra rooms, everything. There was an old stairwell a few stories outside the main window, but even that was too far to reach. The only way in or out was through the front door. You're strong, right? I questioned as I made my way to the front of the apartment. Raven followed close behind, holding her hands out in exasperation. Yes, but I don't know if I could break it. They made it to keep us in, you know. I stopped beside the red wood, tracing my fingers around the doorknob. They made it to keep me in. Raven stopped behind me. I could practically feel the doubt and fear rolling off her shoulders, but I let it do just that. It rolled off of her and melted into the ground, unable to break through my newfound determination to get us both killed. She sighed. The beta's not going to like it if I break his door. With my back facing Raven, I rolled my eyes and ignored her statement. Though I knew it was futile, I gripped the metal doorknob and pulled. Like before, the door didn't budge. The handle twisted, but the wood stayed firmly in place. I bit my lip as the gears turned in my mind. Each thought that passed caused me to pull harder at the door. After a while, Raven huffed and shouldered me aside, rolling her eyes. You're not doing anything. She pushed me back further, and it didn't take long for me to interpret her intentions. My feet carried me the small distance to the kitchen, and I watched as Raven pushed against the door in various places. From my viewpoint, each one was as strong as the last. After a moment, though, she smirked and turned to me. The bottom half gives way a bit. I'm going to try there, but I don't know if it will work. She hesitated then, her eyes growing wide. If there's someone outside this door, they're going to know what we're doing. Her last thought hadn't even occurred to me, but now that it had, I realized why there was a sudden fear in her voice. If Riley or Samuel placed someone outside this apartment to guard me, we were both dead before we even left. There won't be anyone, I spoke firmly, trying to convince myself. Samuel told me the pack was out looking for the humans. Raven readied herself to charge the door, but she abruptly stopped. The humans. As in the humans. The rebellion humans. I shrugged. I guess. Her arms fell to her side, swaying with the motion. If possible, her brown eyes grew even wider. You didn't tell me that. If they're out there and we get caught, then our alpha is the least of our worries. Your alpha isn't a worry at all, I stressed. And we won't get caught. Peyton got a team together and was going after them. She nodded, but it didn't soften the lines creasing her forehead. He is our best hunter, she thought out loud, trailing off. And our best tracker. Exactly. We'll be fine. Raven shook her head, giving me one last glance as she tensed her body like before. She crouched, positioning her shoulder towards the door, then tucked her arms into her chest. Her back leg braced, and in that moment, I swore she was more intimidating than I ever gave her credit for. Before I could dwell on the thought, she simply took in a large breath and charged the door. Her shoulder hit the door right on the mark. A loud splintering exploded through the air, and when Raven pulled back, there was a small hole in the otherwise perfect wood. We both stared at it in shock. My feet carried me forward, but my eyes never left the hole. It was small, but we could easily peel back pieces of the door until it was large enough to fit through. That was too easy, Raven mumbled. I nodded, but I didn't let myself think about it. Riley underestimated you. She scoffed. More like he didn't think I was stupid enough to disobey him. I crouched down, ignoring the pull of my side. I call it bold, not stupid. Raven followed my movements, reaching to pull back the largest piece of wood. Is there a difference? I didn't answer but instead began helping Raven pull back the pieces of splintered wood. It was messy and time-consuming, but eventually, we created a hole large enough for someone to crawl through. I didn't hesitate in doing so, but Raven did. Maybe I should just stay here, she began. Have you knocked me out or something? I was outside the door now, but I stayed crouched down. My eyes scanned the hallway before us, but it was as if the entire building was abandoned. There were no other werewolves guarding us, no indications that anyone had even heard the door breaking. When I was satisfied it would stay that way, I turned to look at Raven through the hole in the door. You know I could never knock you out. You're strong for a human, she stated hopefully. I rolled my eyes. You can stay if you want, but believe it or not, I need you. Raven tilted her head condescendingly. You need me? She scoffed. Right. She began to disappear from the doorway, and as she did, a small sliver of panic once again entered my heart. Raven, I called out. She appeared a moment later, skepticism lacing her eyes. I do need you. I told you I can't do this without you. I don't know this part of town. I don't know the forest. I can't smell things or sense when people are coming. You can, I stressed. She shook her head and disappeared again. I was about to crawl back through the door and drag her out into the hallway until her head poked through the opening. She quickly crawled out, and we both stood outside the door, scanning the hallway once again. You're going to get us both killed. I don't know why I'm doing this. I smiled. In that moment I decided that I liked Raven. Though I was using her and had no idea if I'd actually be able to keep her safe. For the time being, it was nice to be in the company of someone who understood. If only but a little. You're doing it because you know what it's like to have a family. She shook her head, following me as we slowly began our way out of the building. I know what it's like to have them taken away. Chapter 42. We followed the screams. We followed the screams. It was harder than I thought it would be. Will's cries could be heard clearly from outside the apartment buildings, but hearing them wasn't the problem. The problem was that they were distant, almost an echo, and seemed to surround us at every angle. If it weren't for Raven, I would have been lost in finding where they were ultimately coming from. We darted through the streets, my footsteps at Raven's ankles. She didn't mind but even pulled me closer to her at times. We found strength in each other. My weaknesses were her strengths, and it seemed the other way around too. When she'd hesitate, I'd push forward. When I was too reckless to regard danger, she had already searched for it. The one thing I hadn't lied to Raven about was the fact that I needed her. She led the way, as it was easy for her to pinpoint the direction of the noises. I followed closely behind, not only because she could hear Will, but also because I had no idea where we were. When Samuel brought me home from the hospital, I hadn't bothered paying attention. At that point I was so drugged up, so tired and so defeated I didn't see a point. And now I was paying for it. Raven's gaze again darted around a corner, her mouth pressed into a thin line. The coast was clear as usual, but that didn't stop her from shaking her head and muttering to herself. She'd repeated this phrase almost every minute since we'd left the apartment, and after a while it was too hard to drown out. This is too easy. Though at first I denied it, I had to admit Raven was right. It was late, and no one would normally be awake at this hour, but our flight from the apartment had almost been too easy. The fact that we hadn't encountered a single soul in almost the hour that we'd been following Will's screams was enough for even me to question. I wanted desperately to ignore this pressing thought, but my brain wouldn't allow it. Not only that, but Raven reminded me every few feet. Each time she reminded me, another thought struck my core. There should have been someone else watching us. The door should have been more enforced. We should have been caught. But we weren't. And though my mind screamed at me to think about my actions, I wouldn't. I forced the anxiety and panic from my chest, telling myself that at this point, it was too late to turn back. And though the odds were stacked against us in every way possible, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, something was going to go right. That maybe there was some high and mighty being that decided to finally give me a break and allow me to save my brother. Raven pulled me into another back alley, where she scanned the area around us. When she was satisfied, we walked halfway down the street and stopped next to a dumpster. I waited impatiently as she surveyed the area once more. It was hard to have patience with Raven's constant caution when I wanted so desperately to sprint in the nearest direction I thought would be. However, she never took a step without first deciding where that step would lead. Our bodies were plastered against the green metal, attempting to blend into the surface. I had to hold back from rolling my eyes because this was how we'd been moving the entire night. Though I was appreciative that Raven was careful, it was beginning to wear on my nerves. I counted another minute before I finally huffed and turned to face her. "Raven," I harshly whispered. She whipped her gaze to mine, the streetlights from the end of the corner illuminating her wary expression. "We're never going to make it at this rate." She started to speak, but abruptly shut her mouth. Her gaze turned back to the street, but not before she pressed her fingers harshly against my lips. I watched the spot she was looking, but when nothing appeared, I rolled my eyes and pried her hand away from my mouth. "What are you even?" Her gaze whipped back to mine, and for a moment, I saw something glinting in her eyes, something more than caution of an empty threat. It silenced me immediately, just in time for me to hear the soft murmur of voices coming from the end of the street. My eyes widened and my breath hitched in my throat. It was barely there, but once I heard it, there was no denying the sound. There were two voices. They were speaking in low, rushed, and undiscernible tones. Raven's hand on my mouth fell as soon as she knew I saw what she'd heard. For a few long, agonizing minutes, the two of us didn't move. We stayed rooted in place, eyes trained on the spot the voices were coming from. They weren't in our line of vision yet, but we knew they would be soon enough. Two figures eventually emerged around the corner. They hesitated in the opening of the alleyway, one of them glancing around tiredly. The yellow light of the street lamp sent dangerous shadows across their bodies, and it made it impossible for us to tell who these people were. However, I could see one thing. It was illuminated and glinting off the harsh yellow light, hanging limply from one of the figures' hands. A gun. Upon closer inspection, I realized one of them was leaning heavily on the other. They had their arms wrapped around each other's shoulders, and the one who was bearing their weight seemed to be looking for something. Their voices were still low murmurs, but I could also tell now that they were arguing. From the rushed words and harsh tone, I knew they were disagreeing about something important, and that something was exactly what had them stopped outside the alleyway. Raven chanced a glance at me. Her eyes were wide, and her mouth hung half open. I knew she was trying to ask me what to do, but in the moment I had no answer. The two figures answered for us though, when they began moving once more. But instead of continuing like we prayed they would, they limped into the alleyway and towards our hiding spot. The next few moments were torture. From our spot next to the garbage bin, we were concealed from the mouth of the alley. However, if you were to walk further into the alley like these two figures, we'd be in plain sight. Our goal had been to conceal ourselves from people outside the back street, not in it. Not even Raven had planned that they would wander in on us. A quick and reckless plan formed in my head, and before I could talk myself out of the idea, it was already in motion. Raven looked at me again, clearly not sure what I was going to do, but I gave her a curt nod. This did little to ease her tensions. She pressed her lips into a firm line and tried to push herself further into the ground, allowing me to carry out whatever thoughtless plan I had plastered across my face. The two figures kept walking toward us. The minute they were just beyond our spot, I tensed my muscles and shifted my position. As soon as we came into their line of view, I pounced. I tackled the one who was holding both of their weight, immediately aiming for the gun in their hands. The figure was caught off guard, and let out a loud yelp as the three of us came crashing to the ground. We stumbled over the concrete, one after the other, limbs tangling with limbs until the motion stopped, and we were all left on the ground breathing hard. Grimacing, I lifted myself to my elbows, quickly searching my surroundings for the gun. I'd managed to knock it out of their hand, but instead of holding on to it, the gun got pushed several feet away. For half a second I sized up the two figures on the ground. One of them was almost limp, while the other was quickly rising to their knees. I immediately rose to my feet and sprinted for the gun. When I turned back around, one of them was standing holding up their hands in surrender. The other was barely holding their head off the ground. We stayed in those positions for a fraction of a second longer. Each of us stared at each other, not fully being able to take in appearances with the harsh and unhelpful light. Then, Raven steadily rose from her hiding spot and came to stand next to me. "Who are you?" I demanded, as soon as she came to my side. The figure stilled. "Samantha." My brows furrowed at the voice. I recognized it but couldn't place it, so I bit out once more, "Who are you?" My hands were shaking, causing the gun to tremble. I tried to mask this, shifting it to point directly at the person's chest. I also tried to ignore the fact that this was the first time I'd ever held a gun, and in reality I had no idea how to use the thing. However, the two figures didn't need to know this. They just needed a threat. The figure lowered their hands just slightly. "It's me. It's Cade." I stilled. "Cade." "Yes. Now would you please put the gun down? We're not going to hurt you." "Like hell," I growled, pointing it firmly at his head. We were barely 2 feet away from each other, and now that he revealed himself, I could make out Cade's features. His long and dark hair was pulled back but matted to his head in various places. Lines were etched into his face, and I couldn't tell if they were wrinkles or scars. His hands were bloody. Raven shifted next to me. "What's going on?" "I was going to ask you the same thing," Cade responded. His voice was heavy and tired. As he spoke, his gaze kept darting to the figure beneath him, who had given up on standing. I couldn't see their face, but they looked to be in a worse state than Cade. Dark hair was clipped short, revealing bloodied bruises all over their skull. Their entire body was shaking, whether from the cold or the effort of standing I couldn't tell. "He's part of the humans," I spoke lowly to Raven. She growled suddenly, her body tensing. The sound was animalistic, and enough to make me falter and steal a glance her way. Her eyes flashed red, just like Samuel's would always do moments before he lost it. It hadn't really struck me until this moment, but Raven was exactly like Riley and Samuel. A wolf. A deadly, temperamental wolf. A wolf that would change not only her eye color but her entire being as well. In a fraction of a second she could rip us all to pieces. However, for once I didn't have to fear this wolf. She was on my side and I was on hers. Those eyes weren't meant for me. They were trained on Cade. "Back with the wolves, I see," Cade sounded, choosing to ignore Raven's glare. She snarled in response, tensing once more. I laughed bitterly, pulling my eyes back to Cade. "It's not like you gave me a choice. Look, I'm sorry about all that, save it." The figure on the floor groaned. Cade lowered his hands slowly. "Can I help him up? He can't stand on his own." "You're not moving," I firmly stated. "Not until you tell me why you're here and what the hell is going on." "'Kay," he started. "'Kay, I get it. I promised to tell you all of that. But first I need to get him off the ground. He's laying on his wounds and they're going to reopen." I hesitated, and the moment I did, Cade bent down and scooped the figure off the ground. He let out a large moan at the sudden movement, his body flinching violently. When Cade had him standing next to him again, it was in the same fashion as when we first saw them. Their arms wrapped around shoulders, Cade bearing most of the weight. "'Kay, you've helped him. Now don't move," I demanded. "Who is he? What are you doing here?" "This is my brother, Titus. And before you tackled us both, we were minding our own business, trying to get out of here." "What do you mean?" "I mean," he huffed, shifting his weight to hold more of his brother's. As he did, he winced slightly, his left leg faltering. He hit it quickly though, turning his grimace into stone. "That because Titus was injured, we were sent ahead of the group. We're leaving. They came back to rescue us and now we're out of here." "It looks like you're injured too," Raven piped in. "I can smell the blood." Cade sneered. "Yes, we're both not faring too well. Is that what you wanted to hear? Your friends really are skilled. Where are the others?" I shook my head, the gun moving with the motion. Cade eyed the weapon warily. "I don't know. Liar. I don't know. They sent us ahead and we were supposed to meet up half an hour ago. We haven't seen them." "He's not lying," Raven half whispered to me, never removing her glare from Cade. I breathed in deeply, but the moment I did, I had to hold back a wince. The adrenaline had run its course through my body and was starting to leave, and with it came the ever-constant burning of my side. I tried not to make it obvious as I twisted my hips, taking any and all pressure off the still healing wound. It had been getting better, but crawling through splintered wood and tackling men to the ground did little to help that process. Once again I eyed Cade and his brother, distracting myself. Raven's words rang through my mind and I knew she was right. He wasn't lying. They were both in bad shape. Titus's head was now lying limply against his chest, and he made no sound apart from heavy breathing. Cade was breathing heavily as well, and sweat was starting to form on his forehead. His face was paler than I remembered it, and it looked as if he was ready to pass out. How did you get away? I broke the momentary silence. Damaria and what was left of them came back for us. I thought Riley and Peyton killed them all. Cade grimaced. They did. Most of them. The few that weren't captured got away. Where did you leave the others? Samantha, he pleaded. Where did you leave the others? I repeated, more forcefully, re-aiming the gun for good measure. He sighed. We were being followed. In the woods next to the beach. Damaria sent us ahead and told us they'd lead a false trail. She told us to meet up at the edge of town half an hour ago. What happened? Cade hung his head, much like his brothers. I don't know. I just heard screaming. I panicked and brought us here. We wouldn't make it in the woods alone. I stilled. Screaming. Suddenly, I remembered the whole reason we were out here. I quickly turned to Raven. We have to go. She nodded but glanced warily at Cade and his unconscious brother. What do we do with them? I turned my attention back to Cade. He was watching us cautiously, and I didn't fail to notice how his body was half turned away from the gun. Scenarios flew through my mind, each one of them involving me shooting Cade and washing my hands of him, once and for all. If he was betraying me again, killing him would be the best option to ensure we weren't followed or taken. I shifted my thoughts, the more sensible part of my brain trying to take over. It didn't look like either of them could do much harm. One was unconscious and the other looked like he wanted to be. More scenarios flew through my mind, these ones consisting of me letting Cade and his brother go free. Nothing sat right. What are you doing out here? Cade questioned, his voice testing. That's none of your business. He shrugged. The movement took more effort than it should have. Maybe we could help you. Right, I scoffed. Like the time you helped me escape town just to be hunted down. Like the time you got me shot. Like the time you literally threw me to the wolves. I was almost screaming my words at this point, putting all my pain and frustration into Cade. Raven immediately shushed me, putting her hand on my back. I shoved it off forcefully and stood before Cade at full height. Raven glanced around nervously, listening for any signs that someone else had heard me. Cade pleaded with me. I told you I was sorry. I didn't have a choice. I helped you leave though, remember? I cut those ropes. I gave you a chance. It's not my fault if you got caught. I closed my eyes, desperately trying to regain my composure. If I opened my mouth again, I would lose it. I kept telling myself this wasn't why I was here, that I was wasting time, that Cade was simply not worth my words. He'd betrayed me, played me, and practically signed my death warrant. There should be nothing stopping me from pulling the trigger and ending him. But I couldn't. Of course I couldn't. Not because I didn't want to, but because I had somewhere else my efforts were needed. Someone else deserved these bullets. I turned again to Raven. We have to leave. Where do we need to go? She turned to the mouth of the alleyway, tilting her head to the side. As she did so, Cade grimaced. There's wolves out tonight, you know? Not the kind you're used to. It's why Damaria came tonight in the first place. What? I demanded, eyes going wide. There's wolves without control out tonight. Damaria knew most of them would be focused on that and not the prisoners. The only reason we got out. How the hell did she know that? He looked at me warily. I don't know. And I'm not lying. I asked her and she just told me someone tipped her off. One of the old insiders, I'm guessing. Insiders. You know. He looked like he wanted to move his hands, but they were still supporting Titus. One of the people she has on the inside of town. One of the people who would have helped you leave town. I furrowed my eyebrows, mumbling to myself. That doesn't make any sense. Why would they know? I trailed off, searching the silence for my answer. Cade was watching me the entire time, trying to understand my incoherent mumbles. I've got it, Raven suddenly spoke. We need to go before I lose it again. I nodded, bringing myself back to the moment once more. I glared at Cade, adjusting the gun. He kept his eyes on the shining metal, his expression paling further. He looked terrified, and I took pleasure in that fact. How many bullets does this thing have? It's fully loaded, he spoke slowly. It's the last one we have. The others got taken when the wolves killed everyone. Look, if you're going to kill me, I'm not wasting these on you. I cut him off. Cade relaxed almost immediately, but I emphasized, if you so much as cross my thoughts again, I will kill you. Without hesitation. He raised his eyebrows and nodded slowly. I wouldn't dream of it. Raven. I turned to her. She looked at me, almost as scared as Cade. Knock them out. Chapter 43. The world seemed to hold its breath. Another hour passed before we made it to a forest. Because of what happened with Cade, Raven made sure to take things extra carefully. For her, this meant pausing every 30 seconds. I didn't complain though. In all honesty, we were lucky it was Cade and his brother that wandered in on us. Had it been werewolves, we'd have been screwed. Knocking them out was fairly easy. Titus was already unconscious, and Cade didn't put up a fight. He knew when he'd lost. We ended up leaving them inside the small dumpster, and Raven did most of the work in putting them there. It was actually her idea in the first place. She wasn't concerned with their safety, but it would have looked suspicious for two humans to be knocked out in an alleyway. Raven inched closer to me as we scanned the entrance of the forest. The trees were skinny and tall, the green leaves vibrant despite the ending of summer. A small breeze swayed them lightly against each other, as they were placed close enough together to almost be touching. There was, however, a small gap in the trees. That was where both of our gazes were trained. It was as if we were magically expecting Will to waltz out of the forest, completely unharmed and still human. Judging by our luck so far, that wouldn't have been too foreign of a notion. But we both knew it wouldn't happen. Another echo of screams only solidified this knowledge, pushing me forward to act. Come on. I pulled against Raven's arm lightly. Do you still know where they are? She nodded but pulled out of my grip, keeping both of us planted firmly in our hiding spot. We were in yet another back alley, this one much like the last. Brick walls lined the buildings, and the concrete beneath our feet was old and stained. I don't like this, she murmured almost too softly for me to hear. My eyes darted between her and the trees as I bit my lip. Why? What do you hear? Nothing. Nothing new anyway. I listened again for Will's cries. They were less frequent now, but there was no promise they'd ever stop. Then what's wrong? She hesitated. I don't know. This was too easy, so you've mentioned. Raven scowled. Am I wrong? It was my turn to hesitate. I couldn't answer her. We both knew she was right. But if I admitted it, then we'd be further away from getting to Will. We'll be fine. I've got a gun, remember? I waved it in her face for good measure. It was awkward in my hands, but I tried not to let it show. Neither of us really knew how to work the thing, but I'd watched Margaret pull the trigger a few times and figured I could manage. Do you even know how to use it? Raven's voice rose an octave. It's easy enough. You just pull the trigger. This is a bad idea, she groaned, bringing her fingers to massage her temples. I just have a bad feeling. We should really think about this. Something could be wrong. I resisted the urge to roll my eyes. Of course something's wrong. My brother is dying. Her lips pressed firmly together once more and she shot me a glare. When she didn't speak again, we both turned our gazes back to the forest to watch for movement. I don't know what I was expecting to see, or why we were still waiting. Perhaps I thought Cade would follow us. Maybe another wolf would be guarding the forest. Maybe Raven was right. Let's go, I told her, standing up before I lost my nerve. I hadn't heard Will in a while, and I was beginning to grow anxious. Raven hesitatingly followed my actions, and this time, I was the one to lead us forward. At this point, there was only one direction to go. We entered the line of trees, and I was immediately thrown back to the day I left town. Flashes of painful memories threatened to flood my senses, but I pushed them away. They would do me no good. All the images reminded me of was the fact that I'd failed once, and it was very likely it would happen again. But this time it wasn't only my life at stake. I wasn't running through the forest to escape town or a person. I was heading into danger because Will was already there. The light around us quickly faded the further we walked into the forest. Trees grew thicker, foliage hung over our shoulders, and every uprooted tree limb threatened to send me flying to the ground. I walked with high knees no matter how painful it was, in order to make it around the brush. Raven, however, acted like this was her second home. Of course it probably was. Sometime into our journey, she'd resumed the position in front again. Her head was constantly tilted to the side, and wherever it tilted, that was the direction we would walk. Eventually, I started to hear glimpses of what she did. The sounds of Will's screams of agony were no longer solitary. Each cry was accompanied by loud voices, 2 of them, that I immediately recognized. I couldn't make out the words, nor did I care to. Their tone spoke enough. They were rough, demanding, and wary. When I was on the verge of making out the words the familiar voices spoke, Raven suddenly stilled. She crouched low to the ground, pulling my elbow to bring me down with her. I complied immediately, cautiously scanning the surrounding trees for movement. My nerves were on edge, but it seemed I only knew this from the erratic beating of my heart. I couldn't pay attention to myself at the moment, for fear I would miss something around me. Raven turned to me, bringing her lips to whisper in my ear. Even then I could barely hear her words. "If we go any closer, they'll know we're here." I nodded, turning my gaze back to the direction the voices were coming from. They were stagnant for now, not moving further into the forest. The agonizing screams of Will's misery had died down momentarily as well. We were both silent for a moment longer as we listened for anything to tell us to stop, any sign of danger to warn us away from what we were about to do. Then again, even if there was one, I wouldn't have listened. When the silence continued, I stood. It was slow and careful and went against everything my mind wanted to do. I wanted to run screaming to the spot I knew Will would be. I didn't care about Riley, or even Samuel in the moment. I needed to see Will. I needed to help him. But the minuscule rational part of my brain reminded me I needed to be careful, even if this was my brother. So, in the end, I listened to my body. My feet patted softly against the fallen leaves. I made no sound as I walked across the damp, dead material. Raven behind me did the same. My gaze constantly searched the trees, the opening between trunks, the ground beneath me. At any moment I could come upon them, and I needed to be prepared. The moments dragged on slowly. When I was sure time had stopped, and I wasn't even moving anymore, the trees parted just enough to allow me to glimpse carefully around an overgrown bush and into a clearing. The moon shone directly above it, brightly illuminating everything it could. Directly in the middle of the clearing, the moon flashing a relentless glare across his back, was my brother. He was broken. Literally broken. Every limb was displaced and bent the opposite direction it belonged. His face was buried in the ground, and I could see the bones of his spine protruding from his back. It was arched at a terrible angle, reminding me more of a bell than a body. It was then I noticed the hand upon his back. I recognized the hand. It was the same one that held mine, that comforted me so many times before, even when I didn't want it. And it seemed in this moment my brother held those same feelings for Samuel. Will was alternating between digging at the ground beneath him and clawing at Samuel's hands on his back. With his arms breaking with any movement, it wasn't difficult for Will to land strikes upon Samuel. Each time Will got a hold of Samuel, a large gash would appear on this flesh, and Samuel would jump back momentarily. When he'd jump back, he'd come to stand next to Riley. Samuel was never by his side for long, and the minute Will stopped lashing out at him, he'd go back to his side. Riley stayed still. He was barely a foot away from the other two, and he was clearly on edge. His body was tensed, his eyes were glowing, and his gaze never left my brother. His thick arms folded tightly around his body, and each time Will would thrash at Samuel, he'd flinch forward. But ultimately he never moved. He stayed in his position, watching the scene unfold with an unforgiving scowl. I took one more step forward and looked back to Samuel, who was kneeling beside Will again. His face was hard as stone, laced with concentration and determination. His lips moved too quick for me to read, and he was so absorbed in Will, it took the snapping of a twig to bring him back to reality. My gaze flinched down to my foot. Sure enough, and as clutch as it could get, I'd stepped on a pile of broken branches. Raven had almost done the same, but my folly had saved her from moving forward. When I looked up, not even half a second later, Every set of eyes in the small clearing was pointed at me. They each held different expressions, and each screamed at me for different reasons. Once again, though my mind pushed me forward to Will, my body stayed still. It wasn't my move, it was theirs. As if in answer to my thoughts, Will suddenly screamed again. His confused gaze broke away from my face, as he buried his face in the ground once more. Terrible and heavy cracking broke forth from his legs, and it was enough to cause me to flinch backward. By the time the noise was gone, Will's legs looked broken in the middle, almost as if he'd formed another bone there. Will didn't move. He breathed heavily on the ground, groaning loudly into the dirt. The minute he stopped moving, Samuel stood abruptly and stared me down. He didn't wait for me to speak, though. Instead, he balled his fists at his side and stalked towards me. I was tempted to cower, but my body held firm. Even if Samuel didn't want me here, I was. And I wasn't leaving. "What are you doing here?" Samuel came to stand before me. His face was shadowed from an expression, but I didn't have to look into his eyes to know what they held. His voice told me everything. He spoke to me through his teeth with clipped words sharp enough to cut my faade of bravery. "Samuel," Riley suddenly called out. There wasn't a hint of sarcasm or humor anywhere near his voice. When I looked around Samuel's frame, I could see that Riley had moved from his stiff position to kneel at Will's side. However, Samuel ignored the both of them and forced my gaze back to his own. "I'm here for my brother." As if on cue, another round of screams and breaking bones ensued. My eyes darted around Samuel and I got another glimpse of Riley kneeling at Will's side before Samuel harshly gripped my shoulders. "I told you to stay home. You have to leave. This is dangerous, Samantha." He looked past me for a moment, eyeing Raven behind me. If possible, his voice darkened even more. "And you. I specifically told you to keep her safe. You shouldn't have been able to even leave the apartment, damn it." By the time he finished, his voice was much louder than a snarl. He screamed his last word, and this time I couldn't hold back my flinch. I was still gripped tightly in Samuel's arms, and he didn't seem intent on letting me go. "I'm not leaving," I ground out. I tried to sound determined as I pulled harshly against Samuel's grip. "Let me see, Will. I can help him." Samuel bowed his head, but I knew it wasn't out of submission. The muscles in his neck tensed even further, and he seemed to be holding himself back. His hands tightened on my shoulders. "What is this?" Samuel suddenly asked, one of his hands slipping down to grip my wrist. He lifted it, revealing my hand that held the gun. I gripped it tighter, and Samuel didn't fail to notice. However, instead of ripping it from my hands, he forced a sigh and dropped his hands from my wrist. "Raven, take her home." "Samuel!" Riley shouted this time, his voice demanding attention. Samuel flinched his gaze back to him for a moment. "Get over here." Samuel tensed again and raised his head. He stared at me for a long and hard minute before dropping his hand from my shoulder and looking pointedly at Raven. She immediately obeyed his unspoken order and shuffled forward. "Stop." I half turned to her, keeping my glare on Samuel. "I'm going to help him. Let me help him." Samuel clenched his jaw, matching my glare. He didn't say anything though, and when I felt Raven's hand grip my elbow, I snapped. My hand flew behind me, immediately connecting with Raven. It was the hand holding the gun, and when the metal hit her flesh, she cried out in pain. I didn't turn around to see where I'd hit because, in that moment, Raven released me and Samuel growled. I didn't waste time in dodging around him, flying towards my brother as quickly as possible. Samuel was on my heels in an instant, but before he could grab me, I was on my knees next to Will. I wasn't there for half a second. The moment I landed at Will's side, something changed. His back arched further than before, and the broken limbs seemed to solidify. Vaguely, I registered Riley shouting as Will raised his face off the ground and looked at me. For a moment, his eyes held everything I remembered about my brother, but this time, a silent plea lingered there too. Then he broke. His eyes abruptly turned a bright ruby color. A mangled noise escaped his lips. It was a sound caught somewhere between an animal and somewhere between a storm. The limbs that seemed so feeble and broken just moments before tightened and tensed. I stole a glance at Will's face again, but what I saw wasn't my brother. It was a shadow of a human, a soul being taken over not only outwardly but inside as well. He lunged. The world seemed to move in slow motion. 1 minute, I was staring at the broken soul of my brother. The next, a feral half-human was bearing down on me, teeth elongating the closer he came. I scrambled to lift myself off the ground, but it was too late. By the time I got a hold of the dirt, Will was inches from my body. My eyes closed of their own accord, and I waited for the impact. I heard the thudding of two bodies colliding. Pain shot up my leg. Feral, wild, and vicious snarls echoed in my ears. But teeth never sank into my flesh. I waited and waited for the impact, but it never came. Instead, I felt a heavy weight settle on my chest. It refused to move, and after a moment I forced my eyes open. Riley was laying across my chest. His back was to me, and in the distance I saw Will curled into a ball next to a tree. He was breathing heavily, panting, sobbing. Immediately I pushed against Riley, but again he wouldn't move. Samuel was there in the next moment. I watched him sprint to my side and push Riley's heavy weight off my chest. Riley groaned at the movement but made no action to move himself. Instead, he rolled off my shoulders and fell to the grass. He fell on his back next to me, and when my gaze landed on him I realized why he wasn't moving. There was a large chunk of his chest missing. Blood was quickly oozing out of the wound, staining what remained of the shirt he'd been wearing. My world seemed to still for a moment as I watched his chest rise and fall erratically. The rest of his body was completely still, as if moving any other limb would send him over the edge. His eyes were wide open though, and after a moment, he parted his mouth. Unspoken words lingered on his lips, and he desperately scanned his vision, looking for someone to tell them to. Samuel never stilled. He didn't waste a moment. The minute Riley was off me, Samuel had taken off his own shirt and was ripping it to pieces. He wrapped the material tightly around Riley's wound, his knuckles turning white with the effort. The entire time he worked, he didn't take his eyes off Will, who stayed cowering in the brush. Riley, however, was using the last of his strength to feebly try to catch Samuel's wrist. It seemed as if Samuel was the one those unspoken words were meant for, and Riley was determined to speak them. Even if he knew this, Samuel tried to ignore Riley. Ultimately, though, he couldn't. Riley caught his gaze, and both of them stilled. Now that he had our full attention, Riley let out a short breath. He trained his gaze on Samuel, moving his mouth quickly. Though his speech was cracked and barely a whisper, his voice was just enough to deliver the words he seemed so desperate to speak. It was the same sentence, over and over again, repeated until Riley was sure one of us caught it. "You can't lose her." The words eventually died off as nothing more than a whisper of Riley's voice. He leaned his head back, seemingly content, and closed his eyes. His body stilled, though his chest was still rising and falling. Every now and again a shudder would run across his limbs, and when it did, it only caused his rapid breathing to increase. Samuel didn't stop. When Riley finally laid back, Samuel pushed himself to find every gash, every torn piece of flesh, and knit it together with his shirt. Riley was still for the entire endeavor, and the longer this took, the more frantically Samuel worked. "Raven," Samuel suddenly shouted. She appeared almost immediately. He was about to shout another demand of her, but the minute he opened his mouth, both of their heads snapped to the line of trees behind Will. The world seemed to hold its breath as the two of them suddenly ducked low to the ground. Gunshots rang out. They seemed to come from every direction, and it was almost possible to see the bullets cutting through the air. I fell to my back, covering my face and ears with my hands, and buried my body as low as it could go into the brush. As the weapons continued firing, a heavy weight fell upon me. It forced the air out of my lungs and buried me deeper into the earth. It seemed to envelop my body entirely, and I felt as if I was suddenly invisible to the outside world. Large hands were placed next to my ears, on top of my own, and the stubbly jaw of Samuel pressed against my cheek. His body was stiff and still across mine. Gunshots still rapidly split through the air, and even Samuel's hands atop mine did little to dull the ear-splitting noise. In a moment of absolute madness, I slipped my hands from underneath his and placed them on his own ears. If we were going to die, I didn't want him to hear it either. The shooting seemed to go on for hours. In reality, it was barely a minute. When the deafening noises finally died off though, no one moved an inch. The silence was thick, and it seemed as if it were broken. If I stood, everyone around me would be dead. A small whimper eventually broke the silence. It came from across the clearing and was barely louder than a whisper. Ever so slightly, and without moving my body, I raised my eyes off the ground to find the source. They scanned the trees before landing on my brother, who was curled into the fetal position. Blood was splattered across his naked back, and his figure shook violently. I closed my eyes, registering the ringing in my ears. I was also suddenly aware of the weight on top of me, crushing any remaining air from my lungs. It was hard to breathe, and each time I attempted, I only came up with small gasps. I did nothing to push Samuel off me though, as the reality of what just happened was beginning to sink in. He'd thrown himself on top of me, and because of that could very well be dead. A tear escaped the side of my eye, though I hardly noticed it. Softly, hesitantly, I broke the silence. Having Samuel on top of me was torture, and I needed to know if he was alive. Samuel. I breathed. Nothing. I realized my hands were still on his ears. Carefully, I pried them away and tried again. My voice shook, and another tear slipped into my mouth. Samuel. This time he stirred slightly. A soft groan escaped his lips, falling on my ears. Samantha. I choked on a sob. Are you all right? What happened? A moment of silence passed before he abruptly lifted his weight off me. I breathed in a large gasp of air, and Samuel surprisingly did the same. He didn't move from my body but braced himself to hover above me. As he did this, I watched his gaze move across the clearing, and eventually I did the same. Will was still curled into a ball, but now, his trembling had turned into fits of tremors. The trees around him were broken and splintered, and dust was falling from their midst. I turned my head to the side and my gaze landed on another figure. This one was unmoving. Blood coated them completely, and when I saw their disembodied face, cold and lifeless eyes stared back at me. Riley. I let out an involuntary gasp, and Samuel immediately hushed me. My hand plastered itself over my mouth, and I tore my gaze away from Riley. Samuel was staring at the same spot, but unlike me, he wouldn't look away. His face was hard. The only emotion leaking onto his expression was one of caution. Something stirred in the trees behind us, and Samuel immediately whipped his gaze to the noise, growling. He tensed above me, closing the distance between my body and his own. A soft voice cut out, Beta. Raven, Samuel breathed, though he didn't relax. I lifted my body up, twisting my head to find Raven. She was standing behind us, peeking through the line of trees. Parts of the forest were embedded in her skin, hair, and clothes, and she looked as if she'd just been eaten by the earth. Her eyes lingered on mine for a moment before she scanned the clearing. When her gaze fell upon Riley, she flinched backward and gasped. This action seemed to wake Samuel up further, and though he kept a wary eye pointed towards Will and the tree line, he jumped almost immediately to Riley's side. His hands worked quickly. He scanned Riley's body, tilted his head, pressed fingers against his neck. After a moment, he cursed harshly and began pumping his palms against Riley's chest. Every few minutes, he'd lean down over his face, and Riley's chest would rise with air. Then Samuel would continue his pumping, never ceasing to try and breathe life into his best friend. It didn't work. Endless minutes of Samuel beating against Riley's chest, cursing at him, screaming for him to breathe, did nothing. He was dead. And whether it was the wounds Will inflicted on him, or the foreign gunshots piercing the rest of his body, we would never know. Don't let the story end. Subscribe to continue our Wolfpack legend.